I'm really thrilled to be joined by 4 amazing founders this morning, and I am going to let them introduce themselves because they'll do a much better job than I will. But I have Joe Hand with me, the founder of Geeky here, Iggy Bassi, the founder of Savest, Victor, I'm sorry, you're going to... Wortolowski, who's the founder of Airly, and Karen McKellen, who's the founder of Green Epoch. And we're going to talk today about clean cities and what it's going to take to get there. But before they introduce themselves, I'm just going to situate us a little bit in some data, I think always useful. So UBS has just published a report that said it's going to take $150 trillion of investment to get us to net zero. And globally, we're tracking at about 500 billion today. So what's going to make the difference? Well, trust is going to be massively important, as is consumer behavior. I believe innovation is the enabler, the architect of the vision with too little time to put the IPCC's message very mildly. And the best strategy seems to be to accelerate change, embrace universal inclusiveness of solutions, and to invest dramatically ahead of the curve, according to the IEA. From the Future of Work, a recent report said that if we took everybody to 4 days a week, it would be the equivalent of taking every single car in the UK off of the road from a carbon reduction point of view. To autonomous travel, to reimagining public transport, last mile travel, hydrogen commercial vehicles, data connectivity, autonomous operations, end-to-end clean energy, and the role of government to regulate. This topic is vast, audacious, and absolutely and completely vital. So Joe, I'm going to start with you. Firstly, tell us a little bit about Geeky, but you're tackling human behavior at Geeky, and so I want to know what are some of the behaviors we're seeing in cities that most need to be addressed?
Thank you. So I'm Joe Hand, and I set up Geeky, which stands for Get Informed, Know Your Impact, with my husband James in 2017, and our aim is to help people live sustainably. So we felt there was a real disconnect between increasing concern among individuals about climate and the environment and actually their ability to do anything about it. So we provide a platform to companies and any organization who want to engage and educate their staff to cut carbon. And in terms of the behaviors that we're seeing in cities, I think if you, as an individual, if you live in a city, your lifestyle and your carbon emissions are going to be driven by very different factors than if you live in the countryside, for example. So if you live in Cornwall, probably you're going to have high emissions from your vehicle because you have to drive everywhere. You might have a house that's a bit drafty because it's old and, exposed. If you live in a city and you live in a flat, it often might be well insulated. You have more access to public transport, but your diet is a big factor. And actually, if you look at the personal carbon footprints of individuals, we're currently at about 9 tonnes per person per year in the UK, and we need to cut to 2.5 tonnes by 2030 if we're to achieve that 1.5 degree temperature rise threshold. So the changes that we need to see individually are massive, and the largest components of our footprint tend to be food, our homes, and transportation. And then we also include in that services such as banking, pensions, that kind of thing. And it looks different for everybody, but in a city, transportation is a big one that we can really look at, and how we make sure that our homes are as efficient as possible in terms of minimizing the use of fossil fuels that we depend upon, because we cannot reach 1.5 degrees if we continue to rely on fossil fuels for heating and transportation. So those are 2 big factors in cities for people to consider in their own lifestyles.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, the IPCC said we've got 2 decades to get what we need to do to get to 1.5, and that means dramatically declining emissions. Lots is already baked in, and so the behavior has to be pretty kind of dramatic from where it is today. Iggy and Victor, you both are tackling kind of the data angle of this to some degree. So I'm going to come to both of you, and please do introduce your companies. But Victor, I'm going to start with you. You're the founder of Airly, and that's focused on air quality. Why did you pick that to focus on? What do you measure, and how is Airly being used?
Yeah, thanks. My name is Victor. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Airly, and we started a few years ago. That was a simple reason. So I'm the marathon runner, and I was always caring about things that I eat, the things that I drink, but I was thinking about the level of air quality, what I'm breathing. And I couldn't find the data about air quality, and I realized that, it's like a big issue, like 7 million people dying every year because of air pollution, like average global life expectancy reduced by 2 years because of air pollution. And I found it really bizarre that we couldn't find like real-time air quality data. So as engineers, just after university, we decided that we want to create something that will help not only us, but our friends, family, citizens to better understand what's going on with air quality. And we are measuring like air pollution in general. So this is particulate matter, but also gas emission. And we are providing real-time hyperlocal data to our customers, which are governments and enterprise, big corporates that want to understand, but also take some actions. Our mission is to repair the air, and we are doing it by providing the data and environmental insights about air pollution, and like working with many customers across different geographies, and in different countries have different issues with air pollution. Sometimes it's because of cars, sometimes because of coal burning, or different reasons. And this is really challenging because different cities have different problems with air pollution. So thanks to data, they can make like a much better decisions. And it's like helping to reduce air pollution, which is our big goal. And we are always saying that you can't control what you can't measure, which is like a part of DNA of Early.
And you have hardware that you see around the cities. How does that link to the data platform? And then what actions are governments, for example, taking off of the back of the data?
So this is like a hardware and software approach. So we are installing our devices that are measuring air pollution in real time, sending data to the cloud, and then we are providing customer dashboards for our customers. So based on the dense network of air quality sensors, they can drive some behavior change in a city. So like one example is like introducing low emission zone, which is happening in many cities in the UK. But like from Polish perspective, when we are based in Krakow, like Krakow decided to ban coal and wood from the city center to reduce emission. So without data, you can't like make that decision because you don't know what's the source of air pollution. So you need the data to make like a brave decisions, which will really help. Because sometimes we are seeing that some like cities are doing like totally different like things at the same time, and they don't know what's working, what's not working. So that's why you need like clear evidence that your decision led to like decreasing air pollution by, I don't know, like 20 or 30%. That's why it's so important.
And Iggy, you have created a platform that addresses climate risk at Sevest. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that there's no standard audit for climate. Lots of the audit companies are saying they want to be the audit partner, but there is no standard framework. And we heard from the VCs just now that there isn't really a standard way of looking at companies from that perspective either. So how is Sevest helping to address this?
So we use a collection of machine learning models to try and standardize as many of the world's physical risks, because I think one of the things that's really overlooked is how do we understand the physical risks that will happen, not maybe happen, they will happen. So in sort of many ways, we've focused heavily on net zero, which we absolutely should, but there's a certain amount of physical risk which is already locked into the system, whether that's chronic, that's acute. The truth is, a lot of large companies and governments don't know what that risk looks like. They don't know what it means for their valuations, for their supply chains, what it means for their future asset security. So we try and quantify as much of that as possible, but we're not waiting for the world to give us our assets. We've turned the problem around and said, why don't we just create an open platform where everybody can see everyone else's risk at an asset level across what we call multivariate risk. So we don't just look at fire risk and flood risk, we look at a collection of risks together. Then we put an econometric model on top of that to say, well, how much money will you lose? Because I think at the end of the day, we are incentives driven. The city over here is very incentives driven. So the more we can explain how much money are you likely to lose and get that institutionalized as a standard, I think people are more likely to listen then. Now listen, I think the data complexity will remain complex for the next 5-10 years. We don't have perfect data, right? And we live in a world where it's very unlikely, even with all the sensors in the world, we're not going to have perfect data, right? So when people say, well, you don't really know what's going to happen to climate, in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years' time, it's no different to saying we don't know where the stock market will be in, even tomorrow morning, right? We can make estimates, and we have to live with uncertainty. So we try and explain what is the uncertainty in the known science today, and what are the possible pathways that you can take over time.
And you talk about your platform's open. How important has the partnership, the ecosystem part of Savest been to helping with that data quality and helping you move ahead quicker?
A lot faster. So we brought together 3 or 4 research partnerships, which have allowed us to do things with data I didn't even think they were possible 3 or 4 years ago. So we work closely with Alan Turing Institute, Oxford, and Imperial. So they've just given us some very cutting-edge methodology to figure out how can we transfer data from one part of the world to another part of the world. How can we think about estimates in very, very different ways, but with degrees of certainty which are investment grade. Because if you're telling somebody that your building's going to come down because of flood, you better be pretty sure that there's an envelope of sort of probability that is believable, right? Or else, people just won't take the action. And what do? We go into reactive mode. We only wait for when the building falls over or when the city gets flooded, right? We need to move away from that. And for the first time in history, we have the tools to do this. We have the tools to measure more than ever before. So why not make those publicly available? That's essentially what we do.
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, the data sovereignty issues, so important. Accenture's actually taken a strategic minority investment in a company called In Country that is specifically designed to protect data, be able to share standards globally and help you with your data sovereignty challenges. And it's really interesting what you're saying. Karen, I'd love to come to you. Tell us a little bit about what you do at Green Epoch, but also you talk a lot about the need for regulation and how important governments are going to be in solving the net zero issue, and specifically, I think, in urban areas. And I'd love to hear your view a little bit about how far away are we, and I guess what are some of the really innovative things that governments are doing to help regulate around the world?
Okay. I have a company called Green Epoch, through which I make investments in climate tech companies and have done so for some time. Early stage energy originally, and now I'm looking more at waste to energy, a circular economy, and also marine technologies. So my background is in asset-backed solutions to climate change. I started out as a banker. I've invested its principal in some very large emerging market investments in renewable energy, and raised a couple funds to invest in energy efficiency as well as carbon finance projects. So these are some of the things that I'm working on, which are all coming together now with regulation. So regulation has really obviously been driving the adaptation of climate technology, because typically we have this green premium where it's much more expensive to adopt certain technologies which we really need to have on our rooftops. Or we have emerging market risks which still haven't been bought down by any mechanism, so that we can't necessarily finance solar power in an emerging market where it absolutely should be installed, because we're still demanding too much on the debt side, or the currency exchange risk is too high. So there's a lot that can be done on the financial side and also on the regulatory side. Now, I believe that we can affect large-scale wholesale infrastructure much more easily through regulation than we have been able to in the retail space. So with regard to changing our buildings, for example, our building stock, huge issue, and it seems that the government keeps trying to hit the ball out of the ballpark with new green asset financing programs, and they keep flopping. And I wish we could discuss that with Andrew. Unfortunately, he's not here. So the question is, how do we come up with something that's simple, that people can actually implement in their own households without taking a significant risk and settling on a very low payback period, which individuals really don't want to do. So I think that's something that has not been cracked. It needs to happen. On the large-scale infrastructure side, I see a huge amount of, as we said, institutional capital coming into this space. As a past project finance person, one innovation that I've seen, for example, is reinsurance companies coming in with performance guarantees for new climate tech-backed installations, because that's the real problem. You can come up with a technology, and then to actually build the plant at scale and get it running and finance it for 10 or 15 years is a huge ask. And there are so many technologies which are not actually getting built because the finance sector is not playing ball. So the innovation that I've seen is, for example, new kinds of performance insurance, where the insurer will do really deep due diligence on the technology, and then they will insure, say, 10 years of performance, for example, the production of gas, clean gas from plastics or waste, which we never had as project finance people in the past. You add it to the capex of the plant, and you can really launch, full-scale commercialized projects using that kind of mechanism. But there are several others that are now being developed.
Yeah, and you're talking about timeframes again and pushing that out to help, what needs to be built be built. And I think it's super interesting. I think the title of this is about the city of the future. And so I guess a question for all of you, why are cities going to play such an important role in solving this challenge and getting to net zero, in achieving, at scale climate tech solutions? Victor, let's start with you.
That's a good question. I think there are thousands of ways how we can make cities greener, but the question should be how we can make it faster, because we don't have a time for now. So I think there are two main things when thinking about cities, as we are working with hundreds of them. I think first of all is to be open for the innovation, which sometimes it's difficult when we're working with governments. And another thing is about being data driven, because if you have 1,000 things to choose from, then you need to make these decisions based on data. And we see a lot of governments taking some brave actions in terms of reducing carbon emission and reducing air pollution. So we are happy to promote these actions, but sometimes without regulation it's not possible, because there is some kind of regulations about air pollution, let's say, and they are not doing when it's not obligatory for them. So it's it's challenging for us to show the value of the product when you see at the same time that it's not needed by the regulation, and someone from the government is saying, yeah, but I don't need it because it's not written in the, I don't know, some kind of regulation. So that's challenging. But I think cities, they are going to have a big part in moving into net zero. And maybe it will be something controversial what I will say, but I don't think that cities are responsible for polluting the air. Let's say it's ours, it's us citizens. But cities can transform and make some actions and help citizens to move to electric vehicles and so on and so on. So I think it's us, communities, people that are polluting the air, but there's a big part of from cities to be played in that movement into net zero.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to look at the Nordics, Norway, what they're doing with their thermal energy, and I think Amsterdam are all electric by 2025. It's kind of pretty extraordinary what some cities can do to change the course of the world getting to net zero. Joe, what are your thoughts on this?
I think from a perspective of the power of cities, it's as much the concentration of people. The world is becoming much more urbanized, and as a result, cities are a hotbed for progress and change and innovation in a way that is sometimes much more challenging in more rural communities. So actually, we find that most of the large impact organizations that we work with in terms of people cutting their own personal carbon tends to be through big companies who are based in big cities. So although we work with a lot of community groups in rural communities, they generally don't get as much traction in terms of individual behavior change than a big company or a big organization within a city, because there are those networks that just don't exist when you're more isolated and less connected. So I think that's for us really one of the big factors that's going to make cities really in the forefront of all this. And things tend to happen faster in cities for that reason.
Iggy, I mean, through your lenses, we're having corporate clients, what are some of the bravest, boldest things that you're seeing your clients use your data, take, and turn into action?
I think most of them are just a bit fearful, to be honest, once I see the data, once I see the risk. But just to the broader question of why cities, I mean, humanity will be living on cities. I think 90% of all urban areas will be coastal in the next 30, 40 years. Martians may come down in the future and say, why on earth did humanity move to the edge of the riskiest place on the planet? Right? The climate systems, the Earth systems are changing. The interaction between land and sea means coasts will get riskier, right? So whilst we can talk about greening, we also need to have the conversation about we are living in very vulnerable cities, increasingly vulnerable cities. How do we adapt to those? And not all cities are the same. So different cities will have different requirements depending on the exposure that they are expected to have. So whilst we can roll out technologies and amortize them faster in cities, cities are also a lot more vulnerable over time. So there is a power of agency that cities have over rural areas, but I say cities, I'm not sure I'm seeing anything too innovative from the corporate sector just yet, because they're waking up for the first time to climate literacy. It's the first time they're having a look at their risks in a structured way. They're now forced to disclose those risks. And many of them are trying to say, well, you can't use us to sue us, you can't do this or that. The truth is, data will be 15, 20 times more transparent in the next 3 or 4 years. So other people will be co-governing cities at a scale that we've just never seen before, right? So yes, I want the cities to be green, but I actually want them to adapt because they are vulnerable. I'll stop there.
Karen?
Well, obviously, cities are where half the population will be living in a short period of time, and technology also has a much higher adaptation rate in such dense areas. I'm also very concerned about the vulnerability of cities with regard to fire and flooding and air pollution risk around the world. And so it seems like we are heading to a time of great opportunity, but also potential crisis. And that's why we have to focus so much on making our infrastructure adapted to the current situation. If you look, for example, at the collapse of the of that high-rise building down in Miami, which appears to have been related to the water table, and look at how many high-rises you have in every continent along the shore, and you look at how much infrastructure is absolutely vulnerable to just a small increase in the level of the oceans. The amount of money that has to go to make critical decisions about renewing infrastructure, and obviously not all of it will be renewed. So there's going to be a lot of controversy in the future about how we can address these risks. So I mean, it's a big topic, but it's probably the most important topic going forward of our coming generations.
So if we focus on infrastructure, we're not at parity for cost and investment, right? So retrofitting, circular building design, building life cycles, they're not on parity in terms of costs to build, the building or the road in the way that exists today in less sustainable ways. And much of the losers globally are low-income countries, low-income cities, which have a lack of infrastructure anyway. Have you, what's your view on that when you come to where and how we have to bring that infrastructure up to scale? If we look at some specific things like retrofitting and renewal systems or circular construction, and the cost parity versus the fact that we've all said, and everyone will continue to say here today, we are out of time at solving these issues.
In many emerging markets around the world, it's cheaper now. We've reached a tipping point in terms of production of both new and depreciated coal. So we can build, green energy plants, for example, to power cities more cheaply. The problem is that we are still lagging behind in regulation in many of those countries, and access to capital when you build in the emerging market risk is a real problem. I act as an advisor to both a country which is in transition, so it's getting rid of its lignite coal, and it has a huge amount to do in a very short period of time, and also to an African country where similarly they have a new infrastructure that has to be built. And the risk perception and the financial roadblocks are overwhelming, especially when we look at the COP, we look at the commitment that's been made to what they call the nationally determined contributions. In other words, the emission reductions that every single country has committed to. The vast majority of countries do not have that in their national balance sheets to be able to pay for those emission reductions. So who's going to pay? Either we're going to pay here in London and other developed countries, or they're going to have to change the way the finance system allocates capital internationally. And so I know I keep running up against technology versus capital, but I see it all the time, and it's my biggest concern when it comes to infrastructure finance, new projects.
Thank you very much. Joe, I'm going to come back to you and come back to human behavior a little bit. Adoption, human behavior, obviously unbelievably closely linked. So what are some of the technologies that are helping solve this problem that you're seeing are being most readily adopted? And what is it about them that makes the behavior sort of more easily changed?
So I think if we look at the three biggest areas that we as individuals have an impact, our diets, our homes, and transportations, there are some really exciting technologies in each of those areas. So if we start with transport, electric vehicles are, in terms of growth, one of the most exciting transportation technologies that's really looking as if it could be a really meaningful solution. And we're seeing, certainly in the UK, mass adoption, no, not mass adoption, we're seeing increased adoption. But I think there are still significant barriers that policy can really help with here. That's improvement of infrastructure and cost. You know, lots of people we talk to say, yeah, I'd love to have an electric vehicle, I can't afford it. It's as simple as that. And that's where policy is a really crucial part of helping to drive behavior change. And I think it's sometimes really challenging for politicians because behavior change is sometimes a sort of uncomfortable word for our elected officials to talk about. But the reality is it has to happen because we can't go on driving around in diesel and petrol cars. So actually in that case, from 2030s, I think the date still sort of moves a bit, but petrol and diesel cars new will be banned in the UK, which is great news. In terms of our home, air source heat pumps and heat pumps more broadly, but air source heat pumps have huge potential. The International Energy Agency have said that they could deliver 90% of all heating needs globally. And in Sweden, we've already seen about 2 million homes have them, of about 4.8 million. So take-up does happen. Again, there's a cost issue there. You know, there are government incentives, but for most people, it's a big outlay, and you might get the payback, but that's a big challenge for people. And then in terms, the third area, in terms of what we eat, that's much easier. Meat tends to be one of the more expensive components of our diet, and we heard earlier about the huge growth in meat-free options, which are much, much better in terms of, you know, tasting good, which is obviously a big factor, and actually huge growth in vegan products, which is playing out across, I think by 2025, about 50% of Brits will be flexitarian, according to Sainsbury's. So it's definitely a big growth area that is much easier to adopt. You know, you can try something, and then if you like it, people continue. We're definitely seeing that play out. But I think in terms of the barriers for people, it's cost, it's habit, and we're creatures of habit. You know, we need reasons to change, and there's also, combined with all of those components, which is different for climate, this feeling of, what the hell can I do about it? What will I do as an individual? I can't save the world on my own. And of course, that's true. You know, just because you start driving an electric vehicle, it's not going to stop climate change. But the power of the collective and the power of everybody adopting these new technologies, particularly in the absence of policy delivering the solutions that we need it to deliver, I think more and more people are thinking, I've got to do this because policy is not delivering what we need at the moment, and if it doesn't, you know, and we're seeing this particularly within the youth movement, we've got to do it ourselves, and I think that will be a big driver in the future if policy continues not to deliver what we need it to do.
And you've started to work with corporates. You now have a corporate proposition. I think one of the really interesting reflections has been during the pandemic how corporates have stepped in to sort of vaccinate, you know, at Accenture, we provided a fund to India with several other tech companies. We literally sent plane loads of medication and oxygen to India to help, you know, our and other people's employees try and stay safe. So you mentioned in the absence of policymakers, do you think corporates can step into a role here?
Yeah, and that's really a fascinating change that's happened in probably the last 2 to 3 years. So all of the companies that we work with, you know, which range from sort of global banks, global consultancy firms, law firms, etc., they feel comfortable in helping their staff measure and cut their own personal carbon footprint. So we're talking about staff reporting within our system, albeit all of that data remains theirs and only theirs to see, but their food, what they eat, how they live, how they travel, how they save their money, and then companies helping them think about what can I actually do to reduce this. And I think there's a real, it's happening both at senior level, where senior management feel we want to do this for our staff because it's really important to help embed the sustainability mindset across our firm, because we think this is this has become a priority for us, and also junior staff saying, I want to work for a company that takes this issue seriously. And we're seeing it coming either top down or bottom up, but there's a real sea change in terms of it not just feeling that, you know, we'll focus on our operational footprint and cutting that. I think now companies are playing a much more supportive role, actually, in helping staff think more broadly about what they can do individually, which is great.
I'm going to come, Victor, to you for the last question, and then hopefully there are some audience questions, so get thinking. The IEA report that came out this year, you know, was sort of optimistic and pessimistic, like all these reports are, but the optimistic side was we have a bunch of technologies today, we just need to invest in them at a much quicker pace and get them rolled out at scale in a much shorter amount of time. And there is no and. We're not at a choice point of this technology, you know, or this technology, or this technology. We're at the kind of moment of and. It has to be all of them, and then finding the next frontier of technologies. And you talk about knowing that we have to invest and actually, invent ahead of the curve to sort of truly solve this challenge, and that it is at odds with sort of linear government rollouts and things like that. So what's your advice about how we prepare for this as a society, prepare for this disconnect between the pace of technology change and adoption that is required and then the sort of status quo of where society sits?
Yeah, that's like a very, very difficult question. And referring to the things that Joe said before, I think this is the problem of exponential growth of technology versus linear like institutions and governments. And this is like not easy. But I think it's a process, and you know I see an examples working with some cities that are making decisions very fast, and they are very open to the technology and introducing them. But I think the perfect example are scooters across the whole world. Yeah, they were introduced and no one was ready, and like it took governments I think 2-3 years sometimes to introduce some like a legal framework for scooters. And I think it's very similar to all like a climate-related technology. But I think it's a process. It needs to take some time, unfortunately. And when we were starting at the beginning, when talking to mayors of cities, they were like, no, I'm not going to install your devices to show air quality data because people, you know, will get crazy. And you know, we have elections in a few months' time, and that was the fact. And right now, when we are speaking with them and we are saying, okay, for time being, you can have like this data only for you. They are no, I want to share the data with community. So I saw like a massive change over the last 2-3 years, and I think like a COVID helped with that in a good way. But I don't think there's like an easy answer. What we need to do, it's a process. It's a process of sharing how like technology really can help. And I think like Iggy startup is another perfect example how like working with like you know, like a big customers can really help, and how we can use technology to reach our like net zero goals.
Iggy, any comments?
Yeah, listen, I think change is hard, but I think where we think there's a few levers, it's either regulation, but I don't really trust politicians who come in every 4 years, create some What about some structural changes? What about capital markets? What if your shareholders knew 20% of your asset value is going to diminish in the next 15 years? That's more structural, right? So politicians come and go, but assets are here, and there's ownership to those assets, and that's what drives our security. So in many ways, we need to rethink the relationship with assets. But I think policy, you fundamentally need it. I mean, I don't think companies would be disclosing without TCFD today, right? So I think now something like 22,000 companies will be subject to this law in the next couple of years. But also, I think there's a power of exponential technology which we haven't exploited yet.
Yeah.
Right? So I think in many ways, when we talk about the concepts of policy setting and whatnot, we also need to look at things like governance, right? Many decisions will be co-governed going forward because there'll just be radical transparency at assets, on actions, government policies. A lot of change is yet to come in the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years, right? 7 billion people connected to cell phones. Just to the point about emerging markets, yes, if just view the world through the lens of a carbon molecule. They don't discriminate where you are. You are around the planet. If China doesn't behave or if Ghana doesn't behave, it's not going to work. It's not a zero-sum game, right? The whole system, in many ways, needs to change. This is why you need to look at what are the levers of real structural change. And to me, it really starts with capital markets.
Questions? One at the back here. Please tell us who you are.
Thank you very much. My name is Mikhail Bo. I'm the founder of a company here in London called Core Power. Not so much a question as I'd like your comments on something. I mean, we're thinking about cities. The Economist Intelligence Unit said that by 2050, 70% of people around the world are going to be living in cities. And cities need, in order to avoid air pollution, we need to electrify cities. They need to be clean energy. And to have that clean energy, we need that energy to be resilient. And the only way to get resilient energy is either to use hydrocarbons or to use new forms of advanced atomic that are being developed nowadays. And if we're looking across the big cities like London, etc., rather than single points of failure being built around the city, really what we should be looking at is interconnected mini-grids where you create that resilience in those grids as well. So you can do supply of energy to the city, supply of clean water, and of course manage with the waste as well. But it's really a question of counting how many elephants in the room we can see without talking about them. Because nobody, in these debates brings up the only two energy sources that we have that can give us resilience. One is hydrocarbons, and the other one is advanced atomic being built. And I'd like to ask the audience what your thoughts are on this.
Thoughts?
Listen, I think sort of longer term, every part of that energy equation has to be used. So I'm a fan of nuclear power, right? You can't take it off the table, and you can't disinvent it either, right? We have a waste problem with it, and that hasn't been sorted. But I think there's a broader point towards decentralization, right? With all these technologies, why do we have a few monopolies running our energy systems, right? I think in the next, again, 5, 10, 15 years, if we can get to decentralization, we can think differently about the energy mix. But also then you need to look at, so nuclear has huge physical risk problems. Most nuclear infrastructure was set up 40, 50 years ago. 60% of current capacity uses no climate intelligence. They've been put up based on some very rudimentary geological surveys, as opposed to 525 million people live within 50 kilometers of a living nuclear reactor. What if we don't measure that vulnerability properly? So there's lots of safety issues. We can't take it off the table, but fusion could be very promising as well. So I think we need to look at a range of mixes. But I think we don't really have, I mean, there are some governments that will just put the future of energy and water into government hands. We've done the reverse. We actually privatized it all. We've underinvested in some core critical infrastructure and energy efficiency measures. We just haven't invested. But I take your point. We need to put it on the table.
I mean, there are lots of, big companies out there. One of my clients is building a hydrogen business. It's a traditional mining company. It's, making extraordinary progress. I think what BP are doing actually is, quite notable in the way that they've rewritten their whole strategy under Bernard Looney, and the way they're going after solar, wind, electric is through partnerships, through investments, through ecosystems. They've really increased the capital that they're spending on accelerating and enabling companies that already exist to bring those technologies and those, sources of power to scale. And it's going to take sort of absolutely everybody to solve this problem. And so, yes, I think sources of energy are going to be unbelievably important, and how close or far they are from the city centre, because supply chain is also massively important. There's a company here called Arrival that has a micro factory for electric vehicles that are designed solely for the use of sharing. So the car is designed to be shared. And their micro factories are meant to be within very close proximity of a city, so that you don't have long distances of goods being transported, through a supply chain. And so I think there's lots of us to be optimistic about, and the timing light is beeping at us. So with that, I'd like to thank these 4 incredible founders for joining me today. Please give them a round of applause.